Have you ever felt disconnected from the world around you? Not just out of place at parties or in groups, but truly disconnected? As if there were a veil between you and the rest of the people. As if you could see things that no one else seems to notice. Lies hidden beneath beautiful words. Conventions repeated as absolute truths. Ideas that no one dares to question. Perhaps you know this feeling. That strange mix of clarity and loneliness. The pain of realizing that the more you understand the world, the more you see that you live surrounded by illusions, and that almost no one wants those illusions to be shattered. Do you know why? Because thinking is dangerous. I'm not talking about having strong opinions or memorizing catchy phrases to seem intelligent. I'm talking about the solitary and brutal act of using your own reason to dig deep until you reach where it hurts. Until you question the foundations of morality, religion, politics, the meaning of life. Immanuel Kant, over 200 years ago, wrote something that still resonates today. Sapere aude, dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding. It's beautiful, isn't it? But what almost no one tells you is what happens after you dare to know. Because daring to know means putting everything at risk. Your peace, your relationships, your sense of belonging. Kant called this condition in which people live trapped because they are afraid to think for themselves, intellectual minority. It's comfortable to let others think for you, to decide what is right or wrong, what is true or false. And then comes Nietzsche, that brilliant demon, and tears the wound even deeper. He says that the problem is not just that people prefer to live blind. The problem is that they hate those who see. The free thinker is a walking scandal. By merely existing, he exposes the intellectual cowardice of the majority. He reminds people that their certainties are fragile constructions, and for this reason, the free thinker becomes a target of resentment. He becomes the enemy of the herd. Perhaps you know what I'm talking about. Perhaps you have felt that growing discomfort in a conversation circle, when everyone seems to happily agree with shallow ideas, and you have to bite your tongue to avoid saying what you really think. Perhaps you have learned to stay silent because you realized that speaking the truth can cost you friendships, family, even your place in society. Or perhaps you are tired. Tired of this superficiality that surrounds you. Tired of smiling when you want to scream. Tired of wondering if you are going crazy just because you notice things that others pretend not to see. Let me tell you something straightforward. You are not crazy. This anguish that gnaws at you is not a defect. It is clarity. It is the pain of someone who dared to see in a world that insists on remaining blind. Today, we will talk about the greatest tragedy of human existence, not ignorance, but the ability to think deeply in a world that punishes, ridicules, and isolates those who dare to do so. We will dive into the theories of Kant, Nietzsche, and everything these giants of philosophy have to say about the price of intellectual freedom. But I will also show you something even more important. The loneliness of reason and knowledge does not have to be your prison. It can be the passage to the only freedom that truly matters. The freedom to be who you are without bowing your head, without needing to fit in. Most people live convinced that they are free. Free to choose, free to think, free to decide the course of their own lives. But this freedom is almost always a comfortable illusion. Kant saw this with a frightening clarity. For him, the true enemy of humanity was not absolute ignorance, but intellectual minority, that condition in which adults live like grown-up children, unable to use their understanding without the guidance of another person. It is easy to see how this happens. From a young age, we are shaped to obey, not to question. We learn ready-made formulas, what is right, what is wrong, what we should desire, whom we should fear, what it means to win in life. And when we dare to ask why, society responds with silence or reprimand. Thinking for oneself is seen as an act of rebellion, and rebels are punished or isolated. Kant said, "Dare to know." But daring to know is not just about seeking information. It is having the courage to doubt everything, including oneself. It is being willing to lose the certainties that made you feel secure. And that terrifies most people, because it is so much easier to have someone telling you what to think, so much more comfortable to live under external rules without having to bear the weight of one's own moral responsibility. Think about it. How many people do you know who, even being intelligent, prefer to repeat what they heard in videos, books, or social media? How many remain silent because they know that speaking their minds can lead to conflict, rejection, or even losing followers? Intellectual minority is not stupidity. It is fear. Fear of the loneliness that comes with the freedom to think. Kant saw the world as a place where few have the courage to break these chains. And it is no wonder. Those who dare to think suddenly find themselves on unfamiliar ground. Everything becomes uncertain. The truths that once provided comfort dissolve like smoke. And the inevitable question arises, who am I if I can no longer define myself by the ideas I was taught? But Kant also believed in a grand possibility. He believed that if only a few dared to use their own reason, it could ignite a light in the midst of darkness. It could inspire others to do the same. It was a call for humanity to awaken, even if it was a painful awakening. However, there is something even darker, because it is not enough to be afraid of thinking. There is an active dark force that works against those who dare to question. A force that not only discourages, but hates, rejects, and destroys those who think differently. And that is where Nietzsche comes in, because he saw what lies behind morality and social coexistence. He revealed that it is not just about intellectual laziness or cowardice, but something much more dangerous, resentment against the free thinker. And that is what we will talk about in the next part. Friedrich Nietzsche had no romantic illusions about human nature. He looked at the world with the eyes of a surgeon, cold, precise, unafraid to cut deep into the living flesh of society. For him, it was not just laziness or fear that made people avoid free thought. It was something much more visceral, resentment, a deep hatred against those who dare to think for themselves. Resentment arises when the individual perceives, even if unconsciously, that there are people who live outside the herd, who do not follow the same rules, who dare to question what everyone accepts as truth. The mere fact that someone exists as a free thinker is already an insult to collective mediocrity. Because the presence of the autonomous thinker sheds light on the intellectual cowardice of the masses. He is like a mirror, reflecting not only the lies of the world, but also the weakness of those who prefer to live anesthetized. Nietzsche saw the world as a stage for a silent struggle, where the herd, in its comfortable morality, wants to protect its beliefs at any cost. Not out of pure malice, but because admitting that these beliefs may be illusions would mean facing an existential abyss. It would be to accept that what gives meaning to life, religion, moral values, social conventions, may be nothing more than human constructions. And few have the stomach to deal with that kind of truth. That is why those who dare to think differently become targets. And they do not need to make fiery speeches or go out preaching radical changes. Sometimes it is enough to simply exist. It is enough to look at the world with different eyes. It is enough to say in a calm tone, what you believe is not absolute. It is just a narrative. It is then that hatred arises. The free thinker comes to be seen as an enemy of order, as a threat to peace, as a source of discomfort that needs to be silenced, ridiculed, or isolated. Social resentment against the thinker is not just emotional. It manifests in jokes, exclusion, censorship, attacks disguised as humor or morality. Society arms itself to defend its illusions. Nietzsche understood that the herd's morality does not just want you to follow the rules. It wants you to truly believe in them, that you live within the bubble without ever questioning. Because if someone starts to think, others may follow, and then the house of cards collapses. Perhaps you have felt this in your own skin. Perhaps you have been cut off from conversations, seen as negative or arrogant, just because you dared to raise a doubt where everyone wanted certainties. Perhaps you have noticed how quickly people unite against those who challenge the dominant narrative. It is a social survival instinct. Nietzsche knew this, and that is why he had no pity when speaking of the herd. For him, the free thinker is the true noble, but he is also, almost always, a solitary figure. But there is a very high price for this lucidity, because the more you think, the more you distance yourself. The more you see, the more isolated you feel. Nietzsche did not deny this suffering. He merely said it is the price of authentic freedom. And it is about this price, this deep and inevitable loneliness that consumes those who see too much, that we will talk about in the next part. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. There is a loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone. It is a deeper, denser loneliness that arises within the mind of those who dare to see what most pretend does not exist. It is the existential loneliness of the free thinker. Nietzsche knew well what this was. He lived practically his entire life in brutal isolation, both physical and intellectual. Not because he was a hermit by nature, but because each layer of truth he unveiled distanced him further from ordinary people. The free thinker gradually begins to inhabit a no-man's land, a place where their questions sound too uncomfortable. Their doubts are seen as threats, and their clarity is interpreted as arrogance or madness. Imagine living among people who are satisfied with simple answers, ready-made narratives, with the illusion that everything is under control. Now imagine realizing, with almost painful clarity, that all these certainties are nothing but fragile constructs, and that no one truly wants to discuss this. The loneliness of the thinker is not just the silence around them. It is the impossibility of finding an echo for their own questions. That is why Nietzsche spoke of the thinker as a free spirit, but also as someone condemned to misunderstanding. It is not that the thinker wants to isolate themselves. Often, they even long for connection. But how to connect when conversations always revolve around the same superficialities? How to pretend enthusiasm for the routine when one is contemplating the precariousness of all human values? This loneliness has devastating effects. First, it creates a deep sense of estrangement. It is like being outside a lit house, looking through the windows, seeing people laugh, talk, celebrate small victories, while you feel you live in a parallel universe. Then comes the fear of being wrong, the fear of having gone mad, the fear that all this clarity is nothing but delusion. But there is something even crueler. Even when the thinker tries to silence themselves, even when they decide to pretend normalcy, the world seems unwilling to leave them in peace. Small details of everyday life, banal conversations, careless comments, advertising slogans, everything seems to scream falsehood. The free thinker sees cracks everywhere. They can no longer unsee them. And that is where true exile arises, not physical, but psychic. The thinker begins to live in an invisible border, isolated not only from people, but also from the comfort that ignorance provides. It is an exile that has no flag, no homeland, no common language. It is living among men, but feeling foreign in every conversation. However, Nietzsche believed that this loneliness is not just a curse, because it can also be the cradle of creation. It is in this uncomfortable silence that the most powerful ideas are born. It is in this no man's land that the strength to create new values, new perspectives, new truths emerges. But it takes courage to remain there without going mad. Perhaps you know exactly what I'm talking about. Perhaps you have already felt this weight in your chest, this exhaustion of having to silence yourself to avoid losing people, jobs, loves. This frustration of realizing that the more you try to explain yourself, the less people seem to understand. But there is something beyond this loneliness. A next step. Because for Nietzsche, and also for Kant, free thinking does not stop at pain. There is something grand that comes next, the ability to create one's own values, to be the author of one's own morality. And it is about this revolutionary act that we will talk in the next part. Few realize what is at stake when they decide to think for themselves. It is not just about choosing different opinions or challenging common sense in superficial discussions. What Kant and, above all, Nietzsche taught us is that truly thinking involves the courage to build new values. And this is perhaps the most radical gesture a human being can make. Kant believed that by using reason autonomously, individuals could discover universal ethical principles independent of customs, religions, or external laws. For him, freedom was not doing what one wants, but acting according to laws that one's own reason recognizes as valid for all. It was the famous idea of the categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim which you can will to become a universal law. A tremendous demand, because it means that each person has the duty to become a legislator of morality without relying on external dogmas. But Nietzsche took an even bolder and more dangerous step. He looked at this same moral demand and asked, what if there are no absolute foundations? What if all human values are merely inventions, created to maintain order, to protect the weak, to avoid chaos? For Nietzsche, there are no universal values given by God, reason, or nature. There are only interpretations, perspectives, will to power struggling to impose itself. This is where the abyss begins. Because if there are no absolute values, everything becomes relative, but not in the banal sense of everything is permitted. No. For Nietzsche, the absence of universal truths does not mean permissiveness. It means total responsibility. It means that if God is dead, it is up to us to invent new values. Each individual, by freeing themselves from the chains of herd morality, needs to create their own meaning. They need to look into the void and say, even if the universe has no purpose, I will create my own. This act of creation is solitary, painful, almost unbearable, because it requires you to be strong enough to live without guarantees, without the comfortable protection of inherited beliefs. It is like walking on the edge of a cliff every morning. Nietzsche called this being a free spirit. But he also said that the free spirit lives under the constant risk of being swallowed by nihilism, that feeling that nothing matters, that all things are empty, that life is just suffering without reason. It is the price of destroying illusions, ending up before nothingness. But it is in this nothingness that the possibility of creation arises. For Nietzsche, the true free thinker is not just the critic who destroys old values. He is also the artist of life, capable of inventing new values, new perspectives, new goals for himself, even knowing that everything is a human creation. And this requires an almost superhuman strength. Perhaps you feel this tension. Perhaps there are days when you wake up feeling the crushing weight of the insignificance of everything, only to soon realize an inner impulse that makes you want to create something beautiful, unique, your own. Perhaps you live oscillating between the abyss and the need to shape your own existence. It is precisely here that Nietzsche's philosophy meets Kant's at a common point. Both require courage. Courage to create meaning in an indifferent universe. Courage to be responsible for one's own values. Courage to live without crutches. But there is something even deeper in this journey, because the free thinker not only creates values, He inevitably distances himself from the psychological security of conformity. The more he creates, the more he isolates himself. The further he advances, the more solitary he becomes. In the next part, we will explore this paradox. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a cruel and fascinating paradox at the heart of the human experience. The same freedom that elevates us is often the source of our greatest suffering. This is the tragedy that Nietzsche, with his surgical precision, and Kant, with his rational discipline, compel us to confront. On one hand, thinking for oneself uplifts us. It gives us power, autonomy, and prevents us from being mere puppets in the hands of collective morality or dead traditions. It is liberating to realize that we can tear away the veils of illusions, see the world clearly, and have the courage to build our own values. This freedom is sublime. It is, as Nietzsche said, the freedom of the free spirit, one who does not bow to dogmas, who does not accept ready-made truths, who decides their own life as a work of art. But there is another side, dark and lonely, because the more we think, the more we realize how alone we are in this act. People do not want raw truths. They want comfort, security, belonging. They want to be part of the group, to feel accepted, protected by the community. It is natural, human. Life in society is built on consensuses, even if they are fragile or illusory. Those who threaten these consensuses are seen as a danger. The free thinker then becomes a stranger in their own land. They speak a language that few understand, carry questions that no one wants to hear. Even among those who call themselves free, there are unspoken limits on what can or cannot be questioned. And when you cross those limits, retaliation comes. Sometimes it is silent, distancing, averted gazes, awkward smiles. Other times, it is explicit, accusations, ridicule, defamation. Nietzsche knew this better than anyone. He lived this paradox to the core. He preached radical freedom, but paid for it with the most brutal loneliness. He became almost an intellectual outcast in his time, ignored, ridiculed, misunderstood. And yet, he persisted, because for him, living trapped in illusions was worse than any exile. The paradox deepens when we understand that this loneliness is not just punishment, it is also a source of strength. Because it is in this isolation that the free thinker sharpens their vision, consolidates their individuality, and finds the possibility to create something truly new. The thinker who remains true to themselves, even in silence, becomes a living flame. And sometimes that flame is enough to briefly illuminate the darkness around. Kant, for his part, saw this same tension between the security of imposed rules and the risk of freedom, between the obedience that brings tranquility and the autonomy that brings responsibility. For him, human dignity lies precisely in the ability to act according to principles chosen by one's own reason. But this means bearing the burden of never being able to hide behind excuses again. It is a heavy burden, and few are willing to carry it to the end. Perhaps you, who are listening to me now, live trapped in this paradox. Perhaps you deeply desire the freedom to be who you are, but fear the loneliness that it implies. Perhaps you wonder if it is worth sacrificing the feeling of belonging to live according to your own truth. It is a difficult choice, sometimes excruciating. Nietzsche believed it was worth it, even if everything around you screams otherwise, because only in freedom is there the possibility of true greatness, of true creation, of true life. But there is something even more powerful that arises from this tragedy, because despite all the pain, despite all the exile, those who dare to think become unwittingly a spark of hope. a living proof that it is possible to live outside the chains. We have come this far, crossing dense shadows, complex theories, and truths that many prefer not to touch. We spoke of Kant, who urges us to dare to know, and of Nietzsche, who warns us about the hatred that awaits those who dare to think. But all of this, as philosophical as it may seem, is not just distant theory. It is about you, about me, about all of us who at some point refuse to live as silent lambs. The greatest tragedy of human existence is not ignorance, but the clarity that isolates. It is not knowing, it is knowing too much. Because seeing the world as it really is often means losing the sweetness of the illusions that keep people united. It means realizing that morality, laws, and traditions are often just constructions, fragile and arbitrary, and that the security we seek so much may just be a house of cards ready to collapse at the first breath of reason. But let me tell you something important. Even in this abyss, there is beauty, there is strength, there is freedom. Yes, it is true that thinking freely may cost you peace, relationships, the illusion of belonging. But it is also true that, in this brutal silence, you find something that no one can take away from you: the dignity of being the master of yourself, the courage to live by principles you have chosen, the ability to create meaning, even in an indifferent universe. Nietzsche taught us that even if God is dead, life can still be a work of art, that each moment can be lived with intensity, honesty, and, above all, freedom. Kant taught us that reason can guide us, not to find easy answers, but to live with integrity. Perhaps you are feeling this calling within you. Perhaps you feel the loneliness of those who see too much. But know this: even isolated, you are never completely alone. There are others, scattered around the world, who also refuse to accept things as they are, who also carry doubts, pains, and dreams of freedom. If you have come this far, I know there is something in you that resonates with this restlessness, that refuses to live anesthetized, that wants more than ready-made answers. And it is precisely this restlessness that can be the beginning of something grand, not just for you, but for everyone around you. Because every person who dares to think for themselves becomes, unwittingly, a beacon. A small point of light capable of showing others that it is possible to live free. Now, I want to hear from you. What scares you the most on this path of intellectual freedom? Is it loneliness? Or is it the uncertainty about who you will become if you abandon everything you were taught to believe? Tell me in the comments. Let's continue this conversation. And don't forget about the next video. It is important. Everything we talked about today is just the beginning of the journey to understand reality. I'll see you there.